Percy Bysshe Shelley published Prometheus Unbound in 1820. He'd begun the play in 4 acts back in 1818. And during the time he wrote the play, between 1818 and 1820, he was traveling quite frequently around Italy. But most prominently during that time, he and Mary lost two of their children. Clara, daughter, died quite young, and William, a little older, three and a half, died a little later. These deaths, of course, shook Percy Shelley, and Mary Shelley to the core. They grieved deeply over the loss of these children, Mary more than Percy. In fact, it was during this time that Mary and Percy became quite estranged from one another. Mary deeply grieving over the death of her two children. In fact, these two children added to a first child who had already died. She had a child some years earlier prematurely that died within weeks. So Mary's in deep grieving, and she finds Percy not to be much of a comfort during this time. Again, we're talking 1818 through up to 1820, the couple moving around Italy a good bit. Percy tended to deal with grief through distraction, through writing, through reading, but also through cultivating other love interests. So what I'm saying to you is that the immediate biographical context of the writing of this poem is one of grief. And what does grief do but threaten the very unfolding of time? When one grieves, one suffers the inability to embrace the present moment with any hope, and therefore look to the future with anticipation of good. Grieving is retrospective. You're endlessly reliving internally the loss of someone you love. So grief can be quite dangerous over time if one is unable to reassign the affection over the person grieved to a person now living. Then one can be caught, as it were, in reliving the past eternally. In other words, one can become fixed, static, predictable, almost mechanistic, in that the only event that determines behavior is that past event, the event of the loss of the loved one. Second, part of the context, biographically speaking, of this poem would be one of alienation, where we see Percy and Mary grow increasingly estranged from one another. The flush of their early love in 1814, 1815, 1816, through their various travails, loss of children, through their various travels, the stress of that, through Shelley himself being so mercurial, had taken its toll on their marriage. So the threat of fixity, mental fixity, and the pain of alienation are both biographically behind this poem, and we see those two themes show up very prominently in the poem. Now, mythologically speaking, as you can tell from reading the preface, the background of this play is Aeschylus's drama. Aeschylus has a play called Prometheus Bound, and he had apparently imagined a development of that in another play where Prometheus would ultimately tell Zeus what he wanted to know, and Zeus would release him, and the two would become reconciled. Of course, Zeus has shackled Prometheus to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains because Prometheus, whose name means foresight, will not tell him of a prophecy he knows. Zeus overthrew his father to take power, just as Zeus's father overthrew his father to take power. And Zeus has heard a prophecy that he will have a son who will overthrow him. And Zeus is worried about this happening, wants to keep it from happening, and knows that Prometheus knows the woman who will bear this child, Thetis. And Prometheus will not tell him this. Prometheus has no love for Zeus. Of course, Prometheus also is famous for stealing fire from heaven and giving it to humans whom Zeus had only disdain for. Uh, Prometheus taught them how to use fire, how to cook, how to make clothing, was a real savior figure for humankind. So, in this way, as Shelley makes clear in the preface, Prometheus is a figure who rebels against the tyranny of an oppressive God and works to liberate humankind. In this regard, Prometheus resembles, Shelley tells us, Satan. He's thinking of Satan in Milton's Paradise Lost, who vows eternal enmity toward God, because for Satan, God is a figure of oppression, a figure of law, a figure of rules, a figure who really operates more through power than anything else. And Satan opposes this. Prometheus, Shelley says in the preface, is superior to Satan in that he is not driven by envy or revenge. He's driven by compassion for humankind. So Prometheus becomes, for Shelley, and again he's saying this in the preface to the play, a sort of symbol of what is highest and best in humankind. What is best in us? What can we imagine? What world can we imagine that would be the world we would want to live in? What is our best self? When we are at our best, who are we? Well, we are Prometheus. So in this regard, Prometheus is less a character and more a thought, more a mode of being, more a sort of psychological archetype, we might say. Again, we might say that when we feel compassion, when we feel imaginative, when we feel that we are figures of liveliness and connection, then we are manifesting the Prometheus within. So in this regard, we might see Prometheus Unbound as a somewhat Blakean work. Shelley himself says, again in that preface, that the actions of the play are based more on how the mind works than on any sort of external behavior. We remember that for Blake, many of his later prophecies are really psychological dramas where the characters are types for psychological states of being. So, in this regard, we can see Prometheus as an archetype for what is best in us. And we can see Jupiter in the play. Shelley decides to use the later Roman name, Jupiter. We can see Jupiter as what isn't necessarily worst in us, but what happens when what is best in us becomes ruled by hatred. So Prometheus, the great liberator, the great breaker of law in the name of more life, better life for humans, when he is controlled by hatred, as he is when he curses Jupiter, then we can see the Urizen emerging from within. If we go back to Blake, remember Urizen is that part of us when reason or our rational faculty becomes driven by bitterness and hatred. When reason says ultimately, I am the primary faculty, all other faculties such as imagination and emotion and sensation, all other faculties must submit to me. And when reason is driven by hatred, when reason is driven by a will to power, this causes, in Blake's world, a kind of wasteland. The self becomes wasted because it desires all up with no down, all good with no evil, all solid with no fluctuation, predictability, control, security. All of these things that ultimately lead us into a life of stasis and bitterness. So Jupiter and Zeus in this regard are doubles for one another. And that's what I want to talk about for the rest of this lecture, is that when Prometheus is driven by hatred, he becomes Jupiter. And the play makes this very clear early on when we look at the early parts of it, where Prometheus says at the very beginning, monarch of gods and daemons and all spirits but one, who throng those bright and rolling worlds, which thou and I alone of living things behold with sleepless eyes. So from the very beginning, he's saying that Jupiter, you and I alone are constantly watching the world. We have sleepless eyes. So they are two of a kind. No one else is like them. So already there's a pairing of the two. He continues, Prometheus, regard this earth made multitudinous with thy slaves, whom thou requitest for knee worship, prayer and praise and toil, and hecatombs of broken hearts, with fear and self-contempt and barren hope, whilst me, who am thy foe, eyeless in hate, hast thou made reign and triumph to thy scorn, o'er mine own misery and thy vain revenge. Now pay attention here. Prometheus says that he is eyeless in hate. He hates Jupiter so much that he's blinded himself to the world. But also in being eyeless, there's a suggestion that his eyes never close, that he is constantly vigilant in his hatred. And then this is the really interesting part. He says, eyeless in hate, hast thou made reign and triumph. That thou, who does that refer to? It appears to refer to Jupiter. It appears that Prometheus is saying, eyeless in hate, hast thou made reign and triumph. Eyeless in hate, I have made you reign and triumph. In other words, you only gain power when I hate you. If I stop hating you, then you have no power, because in a way you don't exist anymore, because you are the principle of hatred, of rationality driven by hatred. And if I stop hating you, you go away. But then we can read that pronoun another way. Eyeless in hate, hast thou made reign and triumph. It reads the other way. Thou could refer to Jupiter. Jupiter has made Prometheus reign and triumph. Reign and triumph over what? Well, certainly not some kind of literal kingdom, but triumph as the savior figure, triumph as the liberator. So we see already in the very first lines of the play that when Prometheus is in a state of hatred, he is Jupiter. And Jupiter exists only when Prometheus is in a state of hatred. So the two are doubles for one another. Jupiter is an outward manifestation of an inner state of Prometheus. And when Prometheus says, I want to recall my curse toward Jupiter because I now pity him. See, he's shifted. He's no longer fixed. He has shifted into a sense of, I want change. I pity this poor creature. Driven by hatred, because he can only be tormented, driven by hatred as he is. So when he recalls his curse, his Mother Earth says, okay, you can recall your curse, but you have to conjure some figure from the underworld who will come up as an image and speak your curse. And what figure does Prometheus choose? But Jupiter himself. So Jupiter comes as a phantasm and speaks Prometheus's curse. So there's another way where we see these two characters bound up with one another. And the curse really emphasizes how Prometheus is fixed in his hatred toward Jupiter. But when he says, I wish no one to suffer, Prometheus says this, I am no longer fixed in my hatred, then the beginning of the action of the play starts, which will be Prometheus being liberated and Jupiter ultimately falling, because he's no longer given power by Prometheus when Prometheus no longer hates him. So what do we see here? We see Prometheus overcoming fixity, the kind of fixity that Percy Shelley might have been threatened with during the writing of this play. And the minute that Prometheus renounces his hatred, his female companion, Asia, who is not now with him, she's in the valley of the Caucasus, she starts coming back to life. So there's also an overcoming of alienation. Two members of a romantic liaison who have been alienated come back together. So we can see here too the play as suggesting a way to overcome fixity, but also suggesting a way of overcoming alienation. I'm not reducing this play to Shelley's own life at all. I'm simply saying that fixity and alienation are two primary themes of the play, and certainly Shelley was struggling with these two modes of being while writing the actual play.